Hello, in this video, I want to continue on with the series that we've been doing, talking about abolition and the workers' strike. Obviously, like I've said before, I've been having a really good time doing this series, and I'm really interested to get into this next section. I think that it's really important for you to watch this next section that we're about to get into, to watch the last two videos that I just did, talking a little bit about what abolition looks like as a critical affirmative on the workers' strike resolution that's coming up for LD, because I definitely think that that is kind of like necessary to understand what I'll kind of be refuting when I talk about stuff in this video, which is like how teams can better answer critical affirmatives that are coming from abolition on the worker strike resolution. And I definitely think it's an important talking point, because I definitely am thinking like, what are some of the go-to critical affirmatives for this resolution? I definitely think prisoners have to be a really central question of like what is like maybe connected or not connected to the question of workers. And I definitely think it's one that allows you to like definitely have diverse net ground, and allows you to really bring up a lot of like nuanced history and various types of like standpoints that I think can be done in still generic ways, but also in ways that are like really nuanced and calculated. And so hopefully this video can kind of get you closer to that by looking at, you know, what is kind of like just the priorities when you're answering this type of argument, and how you should be thinking about things like the case debate, framework debating, criticisms, counterplans, and dissads. And hopefully walking through this kind of like set of lectures can give you a good idea of like what you should be looking out for, and what are the key ways that you can kind of make these arguments work for you, if these are the types of arguments that you want to go for, or if you think it's just good to kind of have something prepared for these types of affirmatives and ready to go for the first couple tournaments for when this resolution drops, it is ready to go. I think that when we're kind of just first starting off and thinking about like what are some of the places where you can kind of like pinpoint weaknesses in affirmatives that kind of draw from this lit base, I think that a lot of times people have a really hard articulation of being able to win like how they get to abolition, which I think is useful for any type of strategy being read, from case arguments to framework to counterplan to dissad, criticism, debate. I think that as a negative team, your job should definitely be to stress that the other team really needs to have a lens of specificity and an ability to articulate specific offense that allows not only for there to be kind of like contestable ground for you, but also for them to be able to win their access to being able to resolve the types of material impacts they're going to be able to weigh against whatever type of argument that you're reading. I think that always being able to win that like abolition could be like a million things, and that opens us up to not really being able to understand how we get to that from the specific academic space that we're speaking, the role the ballot plays, the role that other debaters play, and that the judge plays, all kinds of complicates the ways that the affirmative is generally thinking about like how easy it is to just like affirm this thing in the abstract. And I definitely think that being able to like trying to like focus in and get specific details on what types of abolition movements are citing, how those movements are organized, and like what, like who are leading those movements, etc., is all important detail to figure out how you really want to contest these types of affirmatives. Because I think the less they can answer these questions and the less specificity they're able to provide, the more arguments you're able to make about like why that shouldn't be weighed against the types of concerns that you're raising, or why the concerns that you're making should just sidestep the question of materiality as a whole, because there is no way to get there, exemplified by the way in which they're trying to like present things in this debate. I also think it's extremely important to try to control the framing debate against abolition, no matter like what side you're on, because I definitely think against like a lot of arguments, abolition is able to thrive through its kind of ability to basically win that the kind of like material ways in which it affects the world differentially from the way in which like differentially comparatively to like the way that state recognition would, is able to kind of like access being able to resolve things like capitalism faster. And I think that depending on what type of strategy that you want to read, it's really important to control whether or not you want the debate to be evaluated on materiality, and what type of role the debate space serves, whether or not it's like a game space or whether or not it's a space for just like hypothetically testing action, whatever, are all really important, so that you don't end up with like all this kind of like loose offense that is supercharged by their ability to win like this top portion of the debate, that I think is just really important to consider. I think when we apply some of this advice to try to think about like what you should be doing on the case debate, I think that a lot of your case debate needs to be kind of like I said before in that first priority, just hammering out the details of like how they're able to access abolition and trying to win like solvency deficits to the things like, for instance, like maybe not straight up crackdown arguments, but barriers to our ability to get to abolition, whether that be no alternatives arising already to like the police existing, there being like a question of like, for instance, like what does abolition and restorative justice look like for those that have done like bad immoral crimes, etc., and how are they able to respond to these various types of concerns, are all good kind of like things to throw at the wall to figure out like how teams are really going to answer the questions of like what the world looks like as the method is kind of coming to life. And then I think secondary to that, depending on like what route you want to go, being able to just contest that thesis off the first place, whether you want to say that racial capitalism is wrong, whether you want to say that the AF is too pessimistic towards like liberalism and reform, that stuff I think needs to be front loaded on the case page, because I think that you need to draw like direct kind of like comparisons between how they're historicizing the workers' strike movement and state recognition of it, it and what that looks like and the way that you're historicizing of it, whether you believe in the state or not, so that you can have something comparative for the judge to see in terms of like how your theories are really coming at each other. And even if you're gonna like take, for instance, a different theory when you go to like a criticism, if you're going to read that, I think that just having something that competes with the thesis of the affirmative and how it gets to like resolving the violence that it claims to solve for is just incredibly important and a good place to have focus. I think that after that, the question of the framework T debate is also super important. I think that if you're going to go for a framework and T strategy, I think the best way to kind of like work against these abolition affirmatives is to make them feel like their relationship to the topic is one of like a link of omission. I think that by trying to win that the idea that like, for instance, that like workers aren't included under the resolution as something that is just a question of like having a different resolution compared to like the resolution itself being bad, and trying to like separate those questions in terms of how you're able to procedurally evaluate debate. I definitely think that this is like a hard line to walk, but I definitely think it's a question of like how that model would justify, for instance, the recognition of like any other movement outside of the worker strike, and why that creates like limitless debates and like groundless debates, and why having resolutions that are centered on particular types of movements are key to like detail for those particular types of movements, and trying not to win like a question of like which conversation is more important, but what allows the basis for debating to happen. And I think that being able to do that is like the important place for where you kind of like start working out at. I think that in addition to that, when you're trying to like win some of these other concerns on framework and T, I definitely think it would be interesting for you to try to play around with what types of planks or tricky plan text you could come up with to try to get a nice TVA against a lot of the arguments that teams want to read for the justification of abolition. Because although I think that there are definitely arguments about why historically the idea of workers and employees has been like scripted outside of prisoners, I feel like there are some arguments to be made about why the standards that can be set by such a precedent that's so different in terms of like what the resolution actually does, that it kind of like changes the terms of like how like powerful we're able to like make the term workers and what it's able to compose of, and how that's able to like kickstart other forms of resistance and revolution. I think making arguments about that type of spillover can make your arguments about the TVA like a lot more interesting, as long as you're able to stop them from being able to kind of like link back to the arguments that you're already kind of making about the loss of ground and limitless debating, etc., and why that can only kind of be made certain in the context of prisoners and not like just like any kind of like group of people. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully gives you a good idea of what are some base arguments you can make against the abolition affirmative on the worker strike resolution. Hopefully you'll tune in for the next video too. Thanks.